Okay, we are going to discuss predetermined absorption rates. Okay, so predetermined means something which we know in advance, and absorption rate is about overheads, that how much overhead we have to absorb into the unit of product. So, a very important topic, and let me start with some simple example. So actually what happens with overheads that you decide it or forecast it or budget it, in advance in the beginning of the period. For example, if we are sitting in 2024 and we know that 2025 budget we have to make. So you find out that how much are going to be your fixed overheads. I'll give an example with the fixed overhead. Let's suppose that you say my fixed overhead includes depreciation, it includes rent, and it includes insurance. Okay. And you have 2000 of rent. I'm keeping very simple numbers, 2000 of depreciation and 1000 of insurance. So your fixed production overhead, because all three of these, they belong to the production department, the factory. So you say that in next year, I'm going to incur $5,000 fixed overhead. Okay. And then you say that how much am I going to work in this next 1 year? So work is usually defined in terms of hours, machine hours or labor hours. So let's suppose that we are talking about labor hours. So we say that how many labor hours we are going to work. So we are going to work 1000 hours. And all of this is forecast. So this is my forecast. This is my forecast. These are not actual numbers. So now there is one word which comes as OAR. So it is called overhead absorption rate. Now, what is OAR? I will explain. Overhead absorption rate. So how do you find out? You find it out as your budgeted overheads divided by your budgeted activity. Okay. So my budgeted overheads are $5,000 and my budgeted activity is 1000 hours and I divide them. So what I get here, I say my OAR is $5 per hour. So overhead absorption rate is $5 per hour. So it means that for every 1 hour I work, I expend my $5 is my budgeted expense in terms of overheads. So in terms of overheads, I'm going to spend $5 per hour. So every 5 hours I work, $5 is spent. Now, absorption rate. So this is called OAR. This is your actually OH, overhead absorption rate, OAR. Now, why do we need it? And how do we use it? So I'm going to show you in detail this topic a little bit on the next slides, but it's easy to understand with the help of a simple example. So let's suppose that you make chair. Okay. So in chair, how much material do you use? So because material is a direct expense, it can be measured. So you say that, okay, I'm going to use, I don't know, $20 of material. How much labor I use here? Labor is my $10. And then because this is direct material, you can measure it. This is direct labor, you can measure it 1 hour, 2 hours, whatever. And then you have to add overheads. So overhead, because I don't spend for one particular table, I give $2,000 rent, $2,000 depreciation, $1,000 insurance. I'm not giving, this is particularly for this particular chair. So this is direct material. I can actually allocate it. Oh, that's which we discussed before, allocation, apportionment, whatever. Okay. So this you can mention easily. This you can mention very easily. These are straightforward. But how much of this 5,000 should belong or should be charged for this chair? How much of this 5,000 belongs to this chair? You say, okay, I'll see how many hours do we work on one chair. We say, oh, we work 2 hours on one chair. So one chair, it takes 2 hours to make. So 2 times 5, $10 is going to be my overhead inside. So my cost of producing one chair comes out to be 40. Then you make tables as well. So in tables, let's suppose that your material is $50. Table is a slightly bigger thing. Your labor is, let's suppose, $20. And then comes the question, how much of this 5,000 should I include in every one single table? I ask you, okay, how many hours do you spend on a table? And you say, I spent 5 hours in making one table. So then I say, okay, 5 times 5, 25. Let's put overhead inside. So I say, okay, my cost of producing one table, or the manufacturing cost or the production cost of one table, is $95. Now, one thing which you need to understand here, that these two numbers, these are actual costs. Okay, these are direct cost. I purchased 1 meter of wood, 3 meters of wood, whatever. I pay 1 hour of labor, 2 hours of labor, whatever it is. So these are actual numbers. But these numbers, overheads, these I have absorbed. We have discussed this thing in the previous session as well, that overheads are absorbed. Absorbed means that they are added into the total cost. They are added into the total cost based on an estimate. So this is not the actual cost. This is not the actual number. This is just an estimate that if I'm going to spend 5,000 in a year, and if I'm going to make 1,000, if I'm going to work 1,000 hours, so this is like hours, okay? Labor hours or machine hours, whatever you may call it. Labor hours, machine hours. So these are hours. So it means that my overhead is estimated as $5 per hour. So when you say I've got $95 cost of making one table, it includes two costs which were allocated. One allocated cost is $50. This is allocated because this was direct. Labor is also direct, so it is also allocated, but this 25 is absorbed. Absorbed means that this is not the actual cost, this is just an estimate. And if it is an estimate, it is possible that your actual cost might be different. It is possible that your actual overheads might be different. So what overheads we are adding? Based on estimate. And this process, we call it absorption costing. This is how you add you absorb overheads into the cost of making one unit. And because it is based on some absorption rate, which we call OAR, and it is predetermined, which means that we plan this thing at the beginning of the year. Okay, so this is a very quick summary which I've explained to you about this procedure. And now let's see what do we have here on this slide. So it says that in absorption costing, it is equal in absorption costing. Let me change some color. In absorption costing, it is usual to add overheads into the product cost by applying a predetermined overhead absorption rate, OAR, $5. The predetermined rate is set annually in the budget. So in this case, we said OAR was $5 per machine hour, $5 per labor hour, whatever you might have, maybe $5 per square meters, whatever. So this paragraph we understood. Then it says that overheads are not absorbed based on the actual overheads. They are not absorbed. They are not absorbed based on actual, but they are estimated. So this is what I was telling you, that these are estimated overheads. They are not actual numbers, because actual numbers you might know at the end of the year, because they're just budgeted figure. $5,000 was my budget. It was my estimate. 1,000 hours was my estimate. My actual overheads could be more, could be less. My actual hours could be more, could be less. But based on my best estimate at the beginning of the year, I do it in the beginning of the year, because actual things I will find out at the end of the year. So if I'm working on January 1st, I need to charge some overheads. So in the month of January, I would not know how much are my actual overheads are. So actual overheads, I will only find out at the end of the year. Okay, so what I do, that I just add them based on some estimate. And then it says that goods are produced and sold throughout the year. So every time you make a chair, you add $10 overhead. Every time you make a table, you make $25 overhead. A chair costs you, I don't know, maybe $60. A table costs you, I don't know, maybe $95. And then you add your profit margin and you sell it. So throughout the year, you produce and sell goods, but many actual overheads are not known until the end of the year. Yeah, because actual overheads will be calculated at the end of the year. It would be inconvenient to wait until the year end in order to decide. So because we cannot wait until the year, so we add it into the product cost by using the method of absorption, or adding the overheads into my unit cost based on some estimate. So calculating predetermined overhead, the absorption rate is calculated by dividing the budgeted overhead by the budgeted level of activity. Just like which I told you, budgeted overhead was $5,000. Budgeted activity in your case was 1,000 hours. It could be 1,000 machine hours, 1,000 labor hours, maybe 1 million kilometers. Because if you are in transportation business, then you are not talking about hours, then your activity, because this is called activity. So how do you define your activity? Okay, so in some factories, activity is based on machine hours. For some factories where there is more labor and less machinery, you define your activity based on labor hours. If I'm in a transport business and I have these cars and buses who go and come, I just run the transport business. So for me, labor hours or machine hours are not important. For me, the kilometers which are driven are more important. So I would divide my forecast budget with my activity, which is in terms of kilometers. And I will say my overhead is $1 per kilometer or 50 cents per kilometer, whatever. For production overheads, the level of activity is often the budgeted direct labor hours or budgeted machine hours. And it is not always, but it is often. Okay. In most cases, for academic purposes, we will take machine hours or labor hours, but in reality, it could be per square kilometer, it could be per cubic meter, it could be per kilometer, and so on. So overhead absorption rates are therefore predetermined as follows. The overhead likely to be incurred during the coming period is estimated $5,000, we said. The total hours which you have estimated, like 1,000 hours, we said. And the estimate overhead is divided by this one to get you OAR, $5 per hour. OAR, overhead absorption rate. So what are the it says selecting the appropriate absorption base. Absorption base means that what should be your budgeted activity. I said machine hour, labor hour, kilometer. Management should try to establish an absorption rate that provides reasonably accurate estimate of the overhead cost for jobs, product, or services. So if I'm dispatching goods, I'm more interested in number of kilometers which my vehicles have to, cover that distance. So I'll be making it overhead per kilometer. If you are working with 1,000 people, you will split your overhead on labor hours. If I'm working with a lot of machinery, I will take my activity base as machine hours. So there are several ways which you can do as rate per machine hour. It could be labor hour. It could be per unit. It could be per unit as well. Percentage of direct material cost. Maybe sometimes it also happens that you say that your overheads are going to be 25% of direct material cost, or maybe a percentage of direct labor cost, 30% of the labor cost. So when I say my overhead is 25% of direct material, so if I'm putting my direct material as 40, then my overheads which will go, this will be 25% of 40, which means 10. Okay. So this is how you can manage it. Or it could be percentage of prime cost. Prime cost means direct cost. So all of the direct costs, you make them together, it is called prime cost. Okay. All right. Lecture example 2. So this is the number. If you remember when we were discussing about reapportionment, we took this number. We said that 2 production department, 2 service departments, and then we had some overheads, and then reapportionment we did. The store cost, canteen cost, it came back here, if you remember from the previous slide. So I'm just taking it very quickly because I'm not explaining here. We already have discussed it earlier. Here, what I just want to see is that I've got 2 production department, mixing and stirring, and the total overhead of mixing department is 175,000, and the overhead of the stirring department is 86,292. You just need to remember these 2 numbers, because this is your overheads for this department and this is your overhead. Now this is the total overhead for the 1 year period or whatever. Now I need to calculate, or I need to somehow take this cost to my unit of output, to my product cost. And how do I take into my product cost? I will absorb it. And on what basis I'm going to absorb? I will absorb it on the basis of OAR, overhead absorption rate. So what you do that once you calculate your total overheads, in a certain department, the next step is to calculate the OAR, overhead absorption rate. So What we say here, the mixing department is a largely machine-based department, whereas the stirring department is largely labor-based department. So it means that if machine, so you have to change the basis. The management of the change the basis means that the machine department overheads will be based on machine hours because it is largely machine-based. Steering department is primarily a labor-based department. So the machine department overheads 177, you should be dividing them with machine hours. And the overheads from the steering department, I'm not sure, it was 84,000 or something. You will divide it with the labor hours, okay? And here you will find out your OAR, which will be X dollar per machine hour. And here you will find out your OAR for the steering department, which is going to be X dollar per labor hour. So this overhead will be machine hour, X dollar per machine hours or X dollar per labor hour. Okay. So let's see, continue with this example. The management of the business have decided that the mixing department overheads should be absorbed based on machine hours and that the stirring department overhead should be absorbed based on labor hours. This is exactly what you do. So you see that if machine hours are more, take your activity as machine hours. So for this mixing department, the activity is machine hours. For stirring department, the activity is labor hours. Okay. The machine hours in the mixing department, so it's just the name, let's call it mixing department, are 100,000 hours, whereas the labor hours for the finishing department, it's not finishing, let's call it stirring department, and the labor hours in the stirring department are 20,000. So we got the number of hours as well, machine hours for one and labor hours for the second, and then we calculate the overhead. So mixing department total overheads were 175 in the previous example. I took from here 175,708, 86,292. So 175 I divide with this 100,000 hours because for mixing department, you are talking about machine hours. I say $1.75 per machine hour. And then for steering department, this 86,292, this overhead we discussed on the previous slide when I was showing you. So 86,000 were the overheads for the steering department. Divide it with these 20,000 hours and you say $4.31 per labor hour. So this is per machine hour, this is per labor hour. So now what do you have? You've got your OARs. What are these ones? This is OAR. So this is overhead absorption rate for the mixing department. This is the overhead absorption rate for the labor department. Now, how it is, so what we did, we calculated the total overheads belonging to one department based on apportionment, reapportionment, whatever we did in the previous session. Then once we calculate the total hours, then we found out what is the total activity and we divide these two and we got one OAR for the mixing and for the stirring department. Then comes the next page. Okay, now this is some example. We will do it later. So if any law, now let me just tell you, let's suppose that they say that there is a product. So what I'm going to do now, just to show you, they say that there is a product whose name is Alpha. So it says Alpha uses $30 of direct material, $20 of direct labor, 4 hours in mixing department, and 2 hours in stirring department. So this is a product which you make, Alpha. For Alpha, your material cost is $30, your labor cost is $20. But then Alpha has to go through the process of mixing, and Alpha also has to go through the process of stirring. And then I ask you, what is the total cost of making 1 unit of Alpha? So you would say, in 1 unit of Alpha, I use material, I use labor, and I use overheads. Material is given as 30, labor is given as 20, these numbers. But how much is the overhead? So overheads are coming from two sources. Overheads are coming from two sources. So you will have your overheads from mixing, and you will have your overhead from stirring department. Okay, two overheads are coming into making 1 unit of alpha. So mixing department has $1.75 per machine hour. So how many hours are used? 4. So 4 hours multiplied by 1.75, 3.5, $7. So $7 of this. So out of this $175,000, $7 are charged, $7 are transferred to making 1 unit of alpha. And then how much is the stirring overhead? In stirring, it says that you use 2 hours. So you've got 4.31 and you multiply it with 2 hours. 1 hour is 4.31. So that makes me 8.62. And then I make a total and I will say that the cost of making 1 unit of alpha, 8715, 1426. Cost of making 1 unit of alpha is $65.62, which includes $30 of material, $20 of labor, $7 of mixing overhead, and $8.62 of stirring overheads. Stirring department overhead rate you calculated. So it means that this out of this 86,000 total overhead, 8.62 goes to making 1 unit of alpha. So this is how, this is how ultimately they will be absorbed into your, unit of product. Now, we have got some good questions here for this particular session, which is the same department, same topic, manufacturing, packaging questions. We do it in the next session. So if we read that question, which we just saw on the screen, so it says that a business has 2 production cost centers, manufacturing and packaging. The overheads and other details for these 2 cost centers are as follows. You've got manufacturing and packaging, 2 different cost centers within your production process. Overheads are $154,000. Labor hours 110,000, machine hours 35,000. Here you've got packaging overhead and you got your 68,000 are your machine hour, labor hours, 60,000 are your machine hours. Now, remember that what you are going to do, the first thing which you say that, okay, this is my overhead, 154. And this 154, I have to calculate my OAR, overhead absorption rate. So it means I have to divide 154,000 somehow with my budgeted activity. So what is going to be my activity? What is going to be my activity? Your activity could be labor hour or it could be machine hour. Which one should I divide with? So 154, should I divide it with 110,000 or should I divide it with 35,000? The answer is always go for the larger number. Whichever activity is in the bigger number. For example, here I can see that labor hours are more, machine hours are less. So just ignore machine hours and you will divide it with 110,000 and therefore you will calculate your OAR as 154 divided by 110, something like $1.2 or whatever per labor hour. So you will calculate your OAR for the manufacturing department. Your OAR should be based on per labor hour. So always go for the activity level which is greater in number. Now, if we follow the same logic, then what happens that in packaging department, this is the overhead 89,000. And it should be divided with the activity level which is greater. So you see machine hours are 60,000, labor hours are 68. So you should be dividing here also as labor hours, logically speaking. So here I will pick up this as activity and here I will pick this as. So in both cases, I should be taking labor hours as my activity basis. However, if you read this information below, it says management have decided that the overheads are to be absorbed based on labor hours in the manufacturing department, and based on machine hours in the packaging department. So in this particular case, the question is telling you to do otherwise. If it is your choice, you would have taken 68,000, which is a bigger number. But because the question specifically asks you to do it, so then you have to do it this way, okay? So now if I continue, so we find out our absorption rate. So we say, how much is the absorption rate? What is the overhead absorption rate per hour in each department to the nearest cent? Manufacturing, packaging, you have to give it the answer. So what you will do, it's very simple. Just 154,000, whatever it is, 178 actually. I'm sorry, the numbers are not correct because I did not change the numbers. It was an example. So I put 178, but the real number was 154. So 154, assuming that it is manufacturing is okay. Let me go back and see how much are the overheads in the manufacturing. Maybe I'm sorry, it's a correct 154 and 89. So 154 by 110 and 89 by 60. So if I come down here, so 154 by 110, 89 by 60. So you get 1.40 per labor hour in manufacturing, 1.40 per machine hour in your packaging. And this option is option B. So 1.4 and 1.8 labor and machine. If I come back here and see the options, B, 1.4, 1.8, manufacturing, labor hour and machine hour. Yeah. So that's the answer. Okay. I mean, all of these are not the options, and option B is the answer. So this is how you will calculate your OAR and then absorb it into the final product.